Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it is Squarepusher Odds and Ends. Alright, it's time for this segment that is always a ton of work for me and not always that satisfying an experience in the end, but I still do anyways because of my completionist nature. I'm going through all the more obscure Squarepusher stuff that didn't get their own video already. Compilations, EPs, rare projects, other stuff I didn't have enough to say on. Now, it doesn't necessarily cover every single little obscure track that I didn't already mention elsewhere. If I missed it here, feel free to yell at me, though it's unlikely I'm going to cover it at all at this point. Either it didn't really catch my interest or I just didn't really have anything to say about it. But regardless, I'm covering as much as I can to fit in this one last video, so let's just get into these, shall we? Let's start out with the 4 side projects, compilations, whatever, that I'd already heard before making this video, starting with Burningn'n Tree. Right, so this compilation puts together a few releases. His Conumber EP, which was the first thing he released under the Squarepusher name, I believe. An EP of his called Alroy Road Tracks, that he released under the name Duke of Harringay, and 3 more untitled tracks of his specific to this release. All really early pre-Feed Me Weird Things stuff from what I can tell. I think I only heard this comp once when I was first going through the Squarepusher catalog in my freshman year of college, but I remember at the time thinking it was kind of meh, and later I took it off my iPod to save space. Coming back to it now, though, it's a lot better than I remembered. I may have to put it back on, because this was surprisingly pretty solid. Is it as good as Feed Me Weird Things? No. I've been listening to that one for years, and this one I only picked up for my second proper listen the other day. But as far as what's basically B-sides leading up to what would be on there, this is some pretty good stuff that's worth your time. Now, not everything on here is that great. Male Pill 5 is disappointing, given how interesting the similarly titled track from Hard Normal Daddy is. And Eviscerate is just some amen break messing around that's not that interesting. The Eviscerate version is better, though. The 3 untitled tracks are all pretty good, but none of them are top-tier work from the guy. The stuff from Alroy Road Tracks were all pretty good, though. Central Line is this wonderfully funky thing. Sark Acid has some nice jazzy melodies in both parts, but especially part 1. Wow, I think that one was my favorite on this whole thing. And Toast for Hardy is quite strange and not very serious, but I very much enjoyed its weirdness and bouncy, playful beats. Nux Vomica isn't as big a highlight, and I could do without the MIDI woodblock sound, but it's still quite enjoyable with some nice mysterious melodies. And the other big highlight from here was, of course, Conumber itself. It's an 11-minute track starting out with some slower, creepier, hip-hop-like beat, and it kept changing and evolving and kept me interested and invested all the way through. So yeah, maybe overall not essential Squarepusher and comes up short when you have Feed Me Weird Things and Hard Normal Daddy right there to compare it to, but I'm always game for more of that kind of stuff. Definitely some good stuff to be found here and worth a listen. I'm gonna have to start putting this one on more often myself as well. I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this one. Moving on from there, it's Big Loada. This was technically released as an EP first, but there's also a more expanded compilation that includes every track from the original EP as well as the Port Rhombus EP in its entirety, and the 2 original B-sides from the Vic Acid single. I'm talking about that version since that was the one thing from this video that I've still kept on my iPod this whole time. It's still a very selection of tracks that are still certainly worth your time. The compilation itself isn't actually available to listen to as one package on iTunes or Spotify or those, but you can find every individual track on there from the above-mentioned EPs. They still have the Big Loada EP, the Port Rhombus EP, and the Vic Acid single. So yeah. Now, admittedly, coming back to Big Loada, it's not as strong as I remember. For instance, when I came back to Come On My Selector for the first time in a while, I was pretty let down. Just kind of a strange, abstract drill and bass piece that doesn't have any strong hook or non-standard sounding drum break. Though there's some bass playing in there too, which is nice. As it turns out, the real highlight from here was A Journey to Redom. The melody on there is definitely the one that stuck out to me the most. Maybe the live version from Electrac helped prop this one up in my memory, though either way that is a classic track and a favorite for sure. Other highlights include Massive Stay Strong, which combines the fast-paced breakbeats with these low-key Boards of Canada style melodies, and Tequila Fish, which keeps standing out and catching my ear. It's a pretty abstract piece that goes all over the place, but it keeps the jazzier melodies strongly in focus. Awesome track all around. Sure, there are tracks that don't offer as much to me personally, like the Bodybuilder and Full Rinse, which are more about the breakbeats than any elements on top. The beats are great, but they're not really the selling point for me. I think I like Squarepusher more for his melodies and jazz elements than his insane percussion arrangements in general. Even these aren't quite on Go Plastic level impressive, but whatever. I'm sure fans of this genre will find plenty to enjoy. Anyways, the Port Rhombus EP in its entirety is good stuff. The actual track Port Rhombus I distinctly remember being my favorite track from here when I first heard this thing. Coming back to it now, it's not as huge a standout, but the combination of those chill, low-key melodies with the fast-paced amen breaks and guitar melodies make for one of the best tracks on here. I found the bass workout of Problem Child to stick out more now. That is a really satisfying bass line he's added here, and Significant Others is like UFOs over Leytonstone but on crack. I think that there's not as much melodies, but the beat, which sounds like it takes from the same percussion patterns, is much more interesting and frantic. The two B-sides from the Vic Acid single, Lone Ravers in the Barn, nothing to write home about. Cool for what they are, but not major standouts for me. As a whole, I do know that Big Loada is another one of those releases that means a lot to a lot of people, and maybe it's not consistently the guy's strongest material for me. But some of his best tracks can be found here for sure, so I would say it's definitely worth your time. I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on the whole compilation. Going on from there, we're skipping ahead a bit to Solo Electric Bass 1. This is actually a mainline Squarepusher album from what I can tell, but I don't personally consider it one and didn't give it its own video because I have nothing to say on it. You know what you're getting just from that title. It's an hour of Jenkinson playing the bass by himself with no accompaniment. Now, I guess in some way, it's cool. I mean, if there's anyone who could manage to pull off an album purely done on the electric bass, it's Tom Jenkinson. But I'm not totally convinced he made it that interesting. He can keep my interest for a while, but not through this entire album. Sure, he's a great bass player, and this album cements that, but was that not kinda already obvious from all the bass playing he's done on his other albums? I say this is just a curiosity when you really get down to it. I'd much more highly recommend something like Ultra Visitor, which also has some solo bass excursions, but has so many other interesting things to keep my interest. Maybe the really big superfans can get something out of it, and I can at least just respect its craft and for holding my interest as long as it did, but I personally find it pretty boring and not worth going out of your way for, returning to, feeling a solid 6 out of 10. And then finally, going back in time to a side project of his under the name Chaos AD called Buzz Kaner. This is like a side project, I guess. It's doing some more acid-heavy stuff. I remember not really enjoying this one at all when I first heard it years ago. Coming back to it, yeah, still don't think it's really for me. But I do know this kind of thing definitely has its audience. Because this is some very noise-heavy stuff, and very intense and abrasive album. Primarily reminds me of some of the noisier parts of Aphex Twin's I Care Because You Do. There are some highlights for me. The acid house elements of tracks like Bioslate and Mind War Electro are quite enjoyable. In general, the acid house stuff provided me with something more to enjoy on this release. And there are some occasional decent spooky melodies like those on Friend Track or Davy's Safety Lamp. I also like the track Generation Shit, which has some pretty funny pitched down vocals. I read somewhere they're actually the voice of Jeremy Clarkson, but citation needed on that one. I can't really confirm it. Could be just Jenkinson's own voice for all I know. For the most part, I'm not into this release though. Tracks like Mail Pill Part 6, which is also kind of a disappointment compared to Part 13, just not fun for me to listen to. That high-pitched ringing a la Ventolin, and that clip at the end of the track which sounds like the voice of some creepy homeless guy while he's jacking off. Ugh, I just can't. I think I'll still recommend giving this album a shot, because I can respect this release for what it is and know a lot of people are more into this kind of stuff than I am. But, it's not my thing. And it's nothing super out of the box or unlike anything I've heard before to begin with, so, I guess a 6.3 out of 10 for me personally. So now we're through the side projects and comps of his that I actually had heard previously. Everything after this I just heard for the first time in preparation for this video. Starting out with Tom Jenkinson solo stuff. Yeah, there's a little bit of material that Tom Jenkinson had released under his own name. A couple of EPs and singles here and there, which is like prototypical pre-Squarepusher stuff. You got the Crot EP, the Stereotype EP, the Bubble and Squeak EP, and a split single with someone else called Dunderhead called Dragon Disc 2. I'm not gonna delve too deeply into these since this video is gonna be way too freaking long already, but some quick thoughts on each release. First of all, the Crot EP. I did not like the Crot EP. It's just some pretty standard, fast-paced, abrasive, underground acid techno that hasn't aged well, and I couldn't really get myself invested in. The Stereotype EP isn't far away sonically, but the variety between tracks and occasional presence of actual melody in the acid synths, especially on the first track, Wooshki, I don't know, that made a big difference, and I thought it was pretty enjoyable, despite not being very distinctive or original yet. So yes, I like Stereotype. Dragon Disc 2, it did have some pretty nice stuff from both people on it. By this point, Jenkinson had already started to define his sound and style and hone it down in, you know, the Burningn'n tree stuff. And while I wouldn't say anything here is essential either, I did quite like all of it. Highlight probably being I Was Livid, especially that old funk sample at the beginning was nice. Whole thing is worth a shot if you're curious. And finally, Bubble and Squeak are two pretty decent tracks as well. Bubble has this beeping by the end that sounds like it's out of a Super Mario Galaxy 2 level from hell. Squeak is the better of the two for me, though. I really like the Rhodes pianos on this one. So yeah, I wouldn't say anything from Tom Jenkinson under his real name is stuff I'm gonna put on my iPod. But if you are a Squarepusher completionist, there is some good stuff to be found around here, and I don't feel like my time was wasted by checking out any of this. I don't feel like handing out ratings to these. Moving on from there, we go to the Maximum Priest EP. I guess this is kind of an offshoot of Budokan Mindphone and Music is Rotted One Note. More that kind of material. Even has remixes from those releases by Oudiker and Wagenchrist, aka Luke Vibert. Also one more by someone named Yi King, who I had not heard of. Interestingly, I enjoyed his remix the most out of those three. As for the original tracks themselves, we got Song Our Underwater Torch, which is kind of an alternate version of Iambic 5 poetry. I swear the drum patterns are just copy-pasted over. And they form a bit of a creepier and spookier tune, along with dripping water sounds placed around it. Unsurprisingly, this is probably the best track on here. Decathlon Oxide is kind of an interesting abstract track that could have fit well on the back of Budokan Mindphone. And You're Going Down has some good melodies here and there, though the 32-second Cranium Oxide is just some buzzing alongside some lady screaming, "Oh no!" and maybe a half-sarcastic manner, I can't tell. I can't say I'd qualify this EP as essential listening by any stretch, only worth it if you were really into both Rotted One Note and Budokan Mindphone and you're craving more of that. I like that sound. I had fun with this. It's worth a shot for curiosity's sake, I guess. 6.7 out of 10, maybe? Going on from there, Square Window. This is an EP that came packaged with some special editions of Ultra Visitor. I didn't mention it in my video on it because I didn't realize it existed. Whoops. Oh well. So I'm talking about it now. So there's 5 tracks on this thing, and all pretty cool stuff that fits pretty well with the Ultra Visitor sound. The title track is kind of slow and plodding and serious, but also a little bouncy. Vaguely hummable melody too. Abacus 2 is a bit lighter and more energetic. Another track with some pretty harrowing but jazzy atmosphere. Probably my favorite track on here. The last 2 tracks here are inconsequential. Nice little live band interlude. And another one with just some weird effects. But that leaves Venus number 17. Saved this one for last because this one was later released as a standalone single in its own right, so which a couple people have asked me about. I guess this was a really exciting single for people who wanted him to return to his old sound. It and its alternate acid mix are pretty good and could fit alright alongside the Feed Me Weird Things and Hard Normal Daddy kind of stuff. Though comparing it to the stuff he'd done on those albums, I don't think they're incredible or anything. The B-side there though, Tundra 4, was the big highlight. I don't think I like it more than the original Tundra, but it's certainly a worthy follow-up that stretches on for 12 minutes. With just as haunting synth pads, just as manic breakbeats, and even more glitchy details by the end. I'm not going to rate the Venus number 17 single by itself, but let's say Square Window for me is a solid 7 out of 10. After that, we are doing Numbers Lucent. Here we have the companion EP to Just a Souvenir. Similar packaging and everything. One would expect this to be made out of the same kind of material, and well, it kind of is, but it kind of isn't. There's no rough, distorted guitars anywhere, thankfully. Most of it is done in the style of the first track from that album, Stereotype 2. Well, okay, there's a little bit of the guitars on the last track, Illegal Dustbin, but it's not really the same. I think a lot of this would work well for someone who wasn't really feeling Just a Souvenir, wanted something more rave-centric or something. The mixing here isn't exactly incredible here either, but it's at least not distracting like it was on Just a Souvenir. The melodies in the first two-thirds of the EP are some excellent stuff here all around, especially the melodies of Paradise Garage and Startime 1. The latter having more bass work than its sequel, but it lives up to its title, especially in the use of its vibraphones again near the end. So yeah, those two were definitely my favorites here. The last two tracks on here are a lot more intense. Arterial Fantasy goes for more old-school drum and bass sound. Some of the whirring noises here remind me of those used on Goldie's Timeless. Though obviously the melodies on top are a lot crazier and more manic as you'd expect. And Illegal Dustbin is like almost comically over the top. The guitars here aren't just a fuzzy pad obscuring details, but rather a lot more percussive, kind of going for a thrash metal kind of thing or something. There's even a key change in there, because why not? The other two tracks, Zounds, Perspex, and Helical Torch, they're not as big highlights, but they've got good melodies as well. All in all, I'm not sure how often I'm going to return to this in the future. I can't bring myself to say I got more enjoyment here than I did out of Just a Souvenir. I think the ideas here there were more imaginative and interesting, but this certainly annoyed me less. Here the mixing and synth tone choices make it more like it's playing out like a soundtrack to some old SNES game. So yeah, I'd say it's worth checking out. Whether or not you like Just a Souvenir, there's some good stuff to be found here. Hey, that rhymed. Yes, I'd say I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. Alright, moving on from there, we got Music for Robots. Now, this was one of the weirder entrants in the catalog. When I first saw this title back when the EP dropped in 2014, I thought he meant it as in music for airports. Like he was making music for the listening pleasure of robots or whatever that would sound like, as something to accompany the Eufabulum album in that super electronic vein. But no, as it turns out, the title means music to be played by literal robots, known as the Z Machines. There's a guitarist robot with 78 fingers, and a drummer robot with 22 arms, and a keyboardist robot that looks like it plays with a laser. Jean-Michel Jarre would be proud. If anyone's going to pull off music that sounds like a live band did it but is beyond what human players are capable of, leave it to someone used to working with these kinds of super frenetic rhythms, but also live bands as well. Jenkinson went into this project with the hopes of supplementing his opinion that music does not need to come from human hands to elicit an emotional reaction. I personally already agreed with that opinion, and as it turns out, he could pull that off no problem. As it turns out, a lot of these tracks are really just more of his jazzy stuff, and presented in a fairly laid-back fashion, more along the iambic 9 poetry lines than the back half of music is rotted one-note stuff. Really, it's not as dark as the album cover would have you believe. There are, of course, some electronic tinges that came naturally with the instruments being played with by robots and being so well synced up with one another. And of course, there are plenty of moments where the playing is so ridiculously fast that not even Jenkinson himself could pull it off, or really any human. Mainly on the track Dissolver. That stuff gets really crazy by the end. But I think I was more surprised that the majority of this EP was more chill and laid back, trying to go for something more emotional. Now, am I likely to return to this a lot? I don't think so. I feel like I need the full context of how they were made to fully appreciate it, and otherwise it's not as big a standout from the guy who's already brought you similar but more effective standalone stuff like on Ultra Visitor. But I love the idea of this EP and how it was executed, so I would say it's definitely worth a listen. I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10. And I'll end this video out with what I believe to be the most recent thing that Squarepusher has worked on, maybe one of the most unexpected things to see his name attached to. He did a soundtrack for this Daydreams Wind Down for Kids with the Cbeebies channel this past April. Which is Cbeebies, I'm not British. Doesn't matter. Ambient music for kids is not something I'd expect to come out of Squarepusher, so I had to check it out of pure curiosity and leave my thoughts here. I sat through the whole thing, the entire hour. I had pretty mixed thoughts while watching it. On one hand, the soundtrack itself was really nice. Maybe not the most original take on ambient music, but it was one that fit his style well. Nothing fancy, but the instrumentation was nice, the chord progressions and harmonies he used, while simple, were just complex enough to not feel like he half-assed it. While maybe not necessarily the greatest stuff ever out of context, I wouldn't mind getting a release of the music from this video by itself. There is one little problem though. If the music and imagery alone were the main attraction of this video, I doubt it'd be able to keep kids invested, let alone for a full hour. It is still a kid's special at the end of the day, and that means we get a narrator. She pops in like every 10-20 seconds and casts away any chances of me ever listening to this again. I mean, I understand why she's there, it's not like the video was made for me anyways, but it does lead to a vaguely similar effect to that of Jean-Michel Jarre's interior music. Obviously not that bad, it's not intentionally unsettling or awkward like on there, but it was a turnoff for me and just highlight that this was made for kids and not so much adults. Is it worth looking into? Sure, I guess. The imagery is pretty, Squarepusher's soundtrack is good, but it does require that heads up before you go out looking into it. I'm not going to give this a rating because I'm clearly not the target audience for that one. But I think that is a good place to finish this video as any, and my god, I am glad that is all over with. Sure, there are other tracks here and there that I haven't covered in this video, but at this point I've plenty overstuffed it already. Hope nobody's losing sleep at my lack of a strong verbalized opinion on I Wish You Obelisk and stuff like that. But I'll finally be getting to the top 10 after this and finishing off this way too long series, so I am ready for that all to be finished. But of course this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.